All right, so are you ready to dive into some really fascinating political territory today?
Always ready for a good political deep dive.
All right, well, think about this. A Democrat and a Republican campaigning together in 2024. It's just weeks away from the election, and everyone is on edge. It's almost like we've stepped into some kind of alternate universe.
Yeah, it's pretty
I
wired.
get it. The political landscape can just feel like this constant barrage of news and opinions, and sometimes it can be really overwhelming.
Absolutely.
So let's all take a breath together and just focus on a conversation that honestly kind of blew my mind. So we've got access to this audio recording of a moderated discussion between then Vice President Kamala Harris and Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. This was held in Michigan.
Wow.
And yes, you heard that right. Liz Cheney campaigning for Kamala Harris.
That's quite the pairing.
It is. So this deep dive is all about trying to understand what brought these two powerful women together, and more importantly, what their message means for you amidst all this partisan noise. Because this isn't just about politics as usual, it's about like a potential shift in the way we think about our political landscape. So right off the bat, we've got to address the elephant in the room. Liz Cheney, who's a lifelong Republican, publicly endorsed and hit the campaign trail for Kamala Harris, who is a Democrat. I mean, if you've been following U.S. politics at all, you know that this is practically unheard of.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you see every day.
It's like seeing cats and dogs suddenly become best friends, right?
Right. What makes this alliance so interesting is that it's kind of a symptom of a much bigger trend we're seeing. American politics has become increasingly polarized, especially after those events of January 6th. That was when that mob stormed the Capitol building.
Right, trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Exactly. And that event really just shook the nation. And so Cheney's actions, while rare, they actually point to this growing discomfort among some Republicans about where their party is headed.
Yeah, it's like she's throwing down the gauntlet, you know? Like in this recording, she flat out says, I was not scared at all to endorse Harris.
Huh.
That really stuck with me, especially in our current climate where it feels like people are kind of afraid to express their political views openly.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that tension.
Does this signal like a potential shift in how we approach political discourse?
It's definitely a bold statement.
Hmm.
But what seems to be driving Cheney is her unwavering belief that Donald Trump represents a serious threat to American democracy. And so for her, defending the Constitution outweighs party loyalty.
Wow, so she's essentially saying this is bigger than politics.
Exactly.
And, you know, it wasn't just Cheney. Both she and Harris spent a considerable amount of time talking about the need for national unity and finding a new way forward, a path that prioritizes shared values over this partisan division.
So it's more about coming together than just focusing on the things that divide us.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, we might not agree on everything, but we can at least agree on what really matters, you know?
And that shared foundation is crucial because they actually do seem to have some pretty major concerns in common. They both talked about threats to democracy, and not just internally here in the U.S., but also from adversaries like Russia.
Right, like they're both sounding the alarm and saying, hey, we need to wake up and pay attention to what's happening around us.
Exactly.
Okay, so get this. Harris brought up this detail that's just jaw-dropping. She revealed that at the peak of the pandemic, while everyday Americans were scrambling just to find COVID tests, the Trump administration was secretly sending COVID tests to Putin for his personal use. I mean, seriously.
Well, that's definitely a shocking detail, but it raises some really serious questions about Trump's judgment and his priorities, especially in the context of his foreign policy decisions. You know, his admiration for these autocratic leaders and his preference for these isolationist policies, those have always been major points of contention throughout his political career.
And then there's the issue that just seems to always be at the forefront of American politics, gun violence. There's this incredibly poignant moment in the recording where this mother in the audience was talking about how her preschooler was about to have their first active shooter drill. It was just heartbreaking. And Harris, who's been a really vocal advocate for these sensible gun safety laws, really connected with her on a human level. You know, it wasn't just about policy, it was about the raw emotion of it all.
Right. Gun control is probably the most divisive issue here in the U.S., and it's so easy to just get caught up in the back and forth. But what Harris stressed, even in this environment that feels so polarized, was the importance of finding that common ground.
It was so refreshing to hear someone acknowledge the complexity of that issue and actually talk about trying to find solutions instead of just scoring those political points.
Right.
It's like she's saying, hey, this is about saving lives, not about winning arguments, you know?
Exactly. And that's a perspective we could all use a little more these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely a very complex issue with really strong feelings on all sides. But her approach seems to be focused on finding practical solutions that can actually make a difference,
Hmm.
you know, solutions that kind of resonate with people across the political spectrum.
And it wasn't all doom and gloom, you
Yeah.
know. Harris also spent a significant amount of time talking about her vision for the future, like healthcare and economic opportunity. One proposal that really stood out to me was her plan to expand Medicare to cover home health care for seniors.
Oh, interesting.
It's like she's acknowledging that we need to take care of our aging population, and this is like a tangible way to actually do it.
That's a really insightful observation. This particular detail speaks to a broader theme in Harris's approach. She seems to be really focused on addressing real-world problems that affect people's everyday lives. It's less about ideology and more about finding those workable solutions that actually improve people's quality of life.
Okay, so prepare to be amazed. Liz Cheney, a staunch conservative, actually admitted in this conversation that this was the first time she'd ever voted for a Democrat.
Wow.
Can you believe that? We're
It,
talking about a political earthquake here.
it really makes you wonder about the future of American politics.
Yeah.
Are we seeing the start of a realignment? Could this be a sign that some conservatives are willing to cross party lines and find common ground with Democrats on these really important issues? It's a development that's definitely worth watching closely.
You know, one thing that really came through loud and clear in this discussion was this sense of anxiety and stress that so many people are feeling about the state of our political discourse. It's like everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But Harris really struck a chord when she talked about the importance of hope and action as like an antidote to despair.
Yeah, that's so important.
Don't let the negativity paralyze you. Channel that energy into something positive.
That's such a crucial message. And it speaks to this fundamental truth about democracy. It requires active participation. We can't just sit back and hope for the best. We have to be willing to fight for the future we want, even when things seem really bleak. And that means engaging in these difficult conversations, finding common ground, and working together to build a better tomorrow.
Speaking of fighting for what you believe in, Cheney had some pretty strong words about Trump's record on national security. It was like she was drawing a line in the sand. This is where I stand, and this is what I'm willing to fight for.
She really painted this stark contrast between her vision of American leadership on the world stage and Trump's approach, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
She called out his praise for these authoritarian leaders, his isolationist tendencies, and what she sees as his willingness to abandon our allies. It was a pretty scathing critique, to be honest.
She basically argued that Trump's approach to national security was not only unrepublican, but actually dangerous. She even went so far as to suggest that Congress might not be able to stop him from making these disastrous decisions.
Wow, that's a sobering assessment coming from someone with her experience and insight.
Yes.
She really didn't hold back. It was like she was saying, enough is enough. We have to speak out against this.
And Harris went even further. She actually brought up the fact that Trump had sent those COVID tests to Putin for his personal use, while Americans were struggling to find them.
I remember that. It was unbelievable at the time, and it still feels surreal to think about it now.
Right, and she framed it as this clear example of Trump putting his own interests and those of a foreign adversary ahead of the needs of the American people.
It's hard to argue with that. And then she brought up his history of disrespecting the military, including his comments about John McCain and calling service members suckers and losers.
Yeah, those comments really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
They did, and they still resonate today.
Absolutely. They were widely condemned at the time, and Harris used them to highlight this fundamental difference in values between herself and Trump. It was her way of saying, this is what I stand for, and this is what I will fight against.
And it wasn't just about words. She argued that Trump's foreign policy, particularly his stance on Ukraine, amounted to surrender.
That's a bold statement.
It was, and it challenged this core element of his worldview.
Right. She argued that such a move would essentially signal to Putin that he could just get away with his aggression, and that it would put our allies at risk.
It's a chilling thought. And then she connected back to the idea of isolationism.
Oh.
Warning that isolationism is not insulation.
Right. It's so easy to just retreat into ourselves and think that we're safe from the world's problems, but that's just not reality.
Yeah, that point about isolationism really resonated with me. It's easy to get caught up in domestic politics and forget that America's role in the world actually has a huge impact on our own safety and security.
Right.
We can't afford to just ignore what's happening beyond our borders.
Right. And both Cheney and Harris made it clear that they believe America has this responsibility to lead on the global stage, to stand up for democracy and human rights, and to support our allies. It's this vision of America as a force for good in the world.
Their message was a really powerful counterpoint to the America First rhetoric that's been so dominant in recent political discourse. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected and that our actions have consequences both at home and abroad.
It's a reminder that America's strength lies not in isolation, but in engagement,
Hmm.
in working with our partners to address these shared challenges and promote these shared values. It's a call for cooperation and a rejection of that go-it-alone mentality.
And that brings us to one of the most powerful moments in the entire discussion. Harris's response to a question about how she handles the anxiety and stress of the current political climate.
It was a really personal and relatable response. She talked about her own struggles with sleeplessness and the importance of self-care. But ultimately, her message was one of hope and resilience. We can't let the negativity consume us.
She urged listeners not to despair, to remember that we have the power to shape the future of our democracy and to actually find joy in the fight for what we believe in.
It was a call to action, a reminder that even when faced with these huge challenges, we can't afford to give up hope. We have to continue to fight for a better future, both for ourselves and for future generations.
And Cheney echoed this sentiment. She emphasized the need for courage and reminded everyone that defending the Constitution is the most conservative value there is.
It was a powerful reminder that our shared values can really unite us, even when our political beliefs differ.
And it's a reminder that even in this deeply divided political landscape, there is still common ground to be found. We just have to be willing to look for it.
And that is perhaps the most hopeful takeaway from this whole discussion. Even in the midst of all this division and acrimony, there is still hope for a better future.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge that this conversation took place in the context of a very specific political moment. We're just 2 weeks out from this very contentious election, and emotions are running high.
Right. It's important to keep that in mind as we kind of process the information we've talked about today.
Absolutely. It's crucial to approach all political discourse with a critical eye. Consider different perspectives and form your own informed opinions. We can't just blindly accept what we hear, even from sources we trust. And that brings us to the moderator's closing quote, which I think perfectly encapsulates the challenge and the responsibility we all face as citizens of a democracy. She shared this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Whatever course you decide upon, there is always someone to tell you that you're wrong. There are always difficulties arising which tempt you to believe that your critics are right. To map out a course of action and follow it to the end requires great courage.
Those are really powerful words. And they really resonate in today's political climate.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone has an opinion these days. And it can be really easy to get bogged down in all the negativity and the doubt. But Emerson's quote reminds us that true political courage often means standing up for what you believe in, even when it's unpopular, even when you're facing criticism, and even when it comes at a personal cost. It's about having the conviction to stay true to your values and to fight for what you believe is right.
So what does all of this mean for you, the listener, as you navigate this often really chaotic and overwhelming political landscape? We've unpacked a lot today. And it's important to kind of take a step back and consider what it all means on a personal level.
Yeah. Here's the thought-provoking question I'd leave you with. What does true political courage look like in today's world? And are you willing to exercise it?
It's a question that challenges all of us to think about our own values and our role in shaping the future of our democracy. Maybe it means having those tough conversations with your family and friends, even when you know you might disagree. Or maybe it means volunteering for a cause you believe in or speaking out against injustice when you see it. Or maybe it's as simple as just staying informed, engaging thoughtfully with different viewpoints, and casting your vote with a clear conscience. Whatever it looks like for you, remember that democracy thrives on the active participation of its citizens.
So keep exploring these ideas. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. Be open to new perspectives, engage in civil discourse, and always strive to be informed and engaged, because ultimately the future of our democracy depends on all of us.
And that wraps up this deep dive. We hope you found this conversation as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the issues that matter most. Until then, keep those minds open and keep asking those tough questions.